Before I jump into the details, I'd like to introduce first what do I mean or we mean by IP-based, what kind of organization is it, what it does, what it has done thus far. Then only we will move on to the topic of valuation, and the practical approach in valuing nature, and some of my own observations based on the work I have been doing with the IP-based for the last several years. Feel free to ask me any question as I go through this topic. It might be some conceptually laden topic in some occasions. So if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. So let me first talk about what do we mean by IP-based. I'm assuming that not all of us are quite familiar with this acronym. It basically stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity System Services. So hence the acronym IP-based. It was an independent United Nations organization. In a very brief, if you know IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC for climate change is similar to IP-based for biodiversity and ecosystem service. So it was established in 2012 in Panama after several rounds of negotiations between countries on its scope and the role. Thus far, the number of members is 143, 137 is incorrect. So we have a few more members by now. So 143 countries or states are part of the member of this UN body. And it basically provides policymakers with objective scientific assessment about the state of knowledge regarding the biodiversity, ecosystems, and the nature's benefit that humans consume or use. And it also provides knowledge regarding the tools, methods, or approaches that are needed to protect and sustainably use the important natural resource we have. The mission of this organization is to strengthen or improve knowledge foundations for better policymaking by use of scientific information. When I say scientific, I'm not solely relying on what we call Western science, but also the information that indigenous people and communities hold since generations and ages. That's also part of this organization's mission when I say scientific information. For the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being, and sustainable development. So it has a very broad mission. To fulfill this mission, it basically performs 4 different functions. The first one is what we call assessment. Assessment means looking at the evidence-based literature, gray literature reports, and the knowledge base of the local and indigenous communities to assess the latest knowledge that we have on a given topic at different scale It could be at a global scale. It could be at a regional scale, or it could be just on a particular topic. As I'm going to talk about values momentarily, the values assessment that was mentioned earlier while sharing the introduction is a thematic topic. It's a thematic assessment. And it also promote and catalyze the support for sub-global assessment. So if a country wants to perform assessment of its biodiversity and ecosystem services, the IP-based promote and catalyze the support for that sort of things, or Asia Pacific region, or Indonesia as a country, for example. Then the second core function of this organization is to identify policy relevant tools and methodologies. So the question, policy relevant, is very important here. Why? It is because oftentimes we have been to do certain kind of changes in our behavior, our programs to conserve or protect nature. But if they are less relevant to the policymakers, then this sort of sound scientific knowledge, even though they exist, are not making their way all the way to the policymaking table. So we need policy relevant tools, methodologies. Then if those tools and methodologies are applied, the evidence generated from those tools and methodologies could be more relevant to the policymakers. So identify policy relevant tools and methodologies to facilitate the use and to facilitate their use and promote and catalyze their further development. So a part of its scope is identifying that kind of tools and methods and also developing and promoting those tools and methods. Then the third core objective is to develop the capacity. So capacity building. It basically means that even if we develop plans and program, in order to implement those programs effectively on the ground, we need capacity, human capital, material or physical capital, or financial resource. All different sort of capacity needs to be developed at a country or a region. So one of the core function of it is also to develop that capacity, particularly the human capacity, prioritize key capacity building needs, and provide and call for financial and other support for priority needs. As an example, recently, maybe last year, the global community sat together to finalize the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. It has far-reaching agendas, targets, but in order to implement those targets, countries, particularly the developing countries, need financial assistance. So sort of assistance, financial and technical assistance, can be organized or can be facilitated through IPBES. And the last core function is knowledge generation. Identifying knowledge needed for policymaking and also catalyzing efforts to generate new knowledge. It does not necessarily involve in new research questions and implementing those kind of research, but through the assessment, through the discussion among key stakeholders, countries, or parties, if there is a need for a new kind of knowledge, it can signal those new knowledge and then in order to explore those knowledge. But that would be done by the scientists or the countries or the local and indigenous communities, not by the IPBES per se, but it facilitates the knowledge generation process. So thus far, I simply introduce what is IPBES, what is its mission and what's its core um, um, functions. But we can capture all of these in a what is called a conceptual framework, how it works and what is the central point of its working. Here, in this diagram, if you look at, there are many boxes, many arrows heading in many directions, but the key point is to think about the center. The center here is the institution and governance and other indirect drivers, which include socio-political, economic, technological, and cultural aspects. The fundamental concept of IPBES is rooted on addressing the issues or problems associated with indirect drivers, the institutions and governance, as well as other kind of indirect drivers that are effectively hindering the need in terms of protecting nature, in terms of generating nature's benefit to people, or whatever the benefit we derive from nature. When I say nature, it could be forest, it could be what, lake, it could be river, nature, the broad term here. So this is the core of it. And these indirect drivers are related to, if you think about this, the direct drivers. Direct drivers, if you look at on the right side, faced by number 2 arrow, there are direct drivers. Some of them are natural drivers. Volcano. In Indonesia, you encounter volcanic eruptions, which damages land, forest, and so forth, including the biodiversity contained in it. But that's a natural driver. Earthquake, volcanic act, natural fire. Those are natural, direct, but natural drivers. But more important and which need much more attention is the anthropogenic drivers, human-made direct causes that are destroying or impacting biodiversity and ecosystems, which includes habitat conversion, deforestation, changing landscape, exploitation of the nature, climate change, pollution, species introductions. These are the direct anthropogenic drivers which are causing a loss of biodiversity and the degradation of the ecosystem. Through the action of these direct drivers, which are rooted on indirect drivers, we are experiencing issues around nature and its values. So what are they? The number 3 arrow indicates nature, which in some other form can be said as biodiversity and ecosystems. Sorry about that. In indigenous and local peoples terminology, in some part of globe, it is also called Mother Earth, systems of life, which captures evolution, biocultural diversity, non-living natural resources, and this kind of attributes of nature is captured by intrinsic values, which means nature has its importance on its own, whether we use it or not. So these direct drivers affects nature and its intrinsic value. If the nature is compromised or degraded, it affects what we derive from nature, which is the benefit or nature's contribution to people. It could be in the form of provisioning, regulating cultural services that we receive from. As an example, timber is a provisioning service we receive from forest, right? And these nature's benefit to people or contribution to people are also affected directly by the institution and governance in place in a country, in a region, and also the type of anthropogenic asset the country or region has. That means built capital, human capital, social and financial capital. What kind of these anthropogenic assets a given place or country has that could influence the nature's contribution to people. As an example, if we have a lot of financial resource, we can invest a lot to protect nature, and nature's gift to people could be enhanced. So these are also important factors which are also in the center of this framework that affect benefit derived from nature. And ultimately, those benefits are there in order to improve the good quality of life, human development, human well-being, nature, living well in balance and harmony with Mother Earth. So these are the ability to achieve a life that people value: food, water, energy, livelihood, and all these sort of things. And these direct drivers also directly impact good quality of life. If there is a volcanic eruption and then in the forested landscape nearby where you live, then your quality of life is compromised. So this is the particular framework based on which IP-based works, with focus on indirect drivers in the center, with the belief that if we address indirect drivers, we can address the direct drivers much more effectively. Thereby, we can enhance nature's intrinsic value, we can enhance nature's contribution to people, we can enhance good quality of life for people. But it also operates in two further dimensions. One is there is a baseline trend and scenarios looking over time. This is a temporal dimension in the horizontal axis, and the spatial dimension in the vertical axis, which is from a local scale in a town, city, region to global scale. So that's the spatial scale in which it operates. And IP-based particularly focuses on the national to global, that's its scope, but it also works, or it also influences these local to cases, which we refer here as the level of resolution. So this is, in other words, is a workhorse of the IP base. Based on this, it operates. So I think I gave you a very quick introduction of the base and its mission, its core functions, and also how it works in terms of its conceptual framework. Let's move on to the key topic of today, which is values and valuation. Values, what does value mean? Value refers to a principle associated with a given worldview or cultural context. For example, for local and indigenous communities, how do they look at a tree or a river or a fire? It's completely different than some external individual. So it refers to the principle associated with a given worldview, a local and indigenous worldview, Western and scientific worldview, or a cultural context. If you believe on a particular type of culture, so value refers to the principle associated with that. It also means a preference someone has for a particular state of the world. You value something, you value animal rights, you value intrinsic values of the nature itself. So it also refers to someone's preference. It also signifies the importance of something for itself or for others. If you value something, it means you put importance to that in a relative term with some other thing. And it can also be a measure. It can be used to measure different things together. So value has multiple meanings. Farmers may value the food they produce in different ways by considering it to be a pure market commodity, which is a market-based way of thinking about the value of the food, or as an integral part of the continued cultural identity and self-determination, which is non-marketed, but rooted on the cultural aspect of it. So same thing can be valued differently. The wide different types of values through which we attribute meaning and importance to nature's benefit to people or contribution to people, but they are rarely recognized or explicitly taken into the decision making. The problem we are encountering is this bit. Even if we recognize them, then they have not been explicitly taken into the decision making until and unless decision makers embed these values into their decision making. We may not be able to achieve the mission and the visions in nature conservation, nature protection, improving people's well-being through those activities. Identifying such diversity of values of individuals and social groups is often challenging. It is difficult. It's not that easy. But if we say it's challenging and difficult and we can't do it, if we continue to behave in that way, not doing so can undermine the very objective of those decisions that produce unsustainable outcome. Decision makers make decisions to improve things, whether it is about nature, forest, wetland, rivers, hills, plains. But the objective is to improve the situation. In order to improve the situation, we need to understand the values held by a different group of people associated with that. And if we don't understand that, then it undermines the whole purpose of the decisions that we make. So understanding diversity of values of the nature's contribution to people entails two key principles. One, valuation and value assessments require the recognition of a broad range of worldviews. So whether how do we value things, or how do we assess people's view about nature, need broad range of worldviews, not a narrow, very specific form of broad enough. We need to be a little bit more holistic in thinking, which will promote different conceptualization of value and valuations. Valuation means a way of valuing things. Nature, like a property manager or property agent would value the house, means they do valuation of the house, looking at the house characteristics, what kind of features it has. They put certain price tag on a house, and they have the process by which they come to that value is valuation. Same thing, as a scientist or as an ordinary person, we ascribe some sort of values to nature through that sort of thinking. That's part of the valuation. And it also promotes transdisciplinary collaboration. If we look at in a holistic way or broad views, so more transdisciplinary collaboration, because we need multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach to address nature-related problems. And the second principle is incorporation of value and valuation methods into decision-making processes are themselves value-laden. Means even if we embed it, we are capturing possibly a particular form of value or a range of values, not perhaps every kind of values that are out there. So it also has some value-laden implication. The adapted approach to valuation depends on people's particular ways of thinking, their perspective, and the ways in which these influence their interaction with nature. As an example here, if we are talking about protecting a forested land nearby, think of nearby your own village, there could be a different group of people in the village, and they view the forested land differently. For some, it's the source of firewood. For some, it's a source of recreation. For some others, it's an area that protects the water bodies, or it's supporting the water supply to the village. And they put different emphasis on these things. And whatever the approach you decided might have a slightly higher preference for one way of thinking than the other. So that's what this second principle. So if we look at what is the main focus of value in terms of the IP-based approach of working in nature conservation, it focuses on nature itself because it has its intrinsic value, whether it provides any material benefit to people or not. We value nature. It has its intrinsic, means it is important on its own, regardless of whether it provides any service or not. Then the second focus is on, because it provides benefit to people, that's the nature's contribution to people, and also it supports good quality of life. So that's the focus of the value. three foci of the value, and the main types of it captures is for nature, it's the intrinsic value. Nature's contribution to people is the instrumental value. It's the means to the end. And good quality of life is the relational value. With different foci of value relation to nature, nature contribution to people, and good quality of life. So they are primarily associated with those three different types of values. Well, here, nature, it is the intrinsic value. As an example, animals' welfare or rights. The Mother Earth, evolutionary and ecological processes, genetic diversity, species diversity, they have their own right. So these are the example of intrinsic values of nature. If you think about the instrumental values, which are more anthropocentric, means human-centric, the instrumental values could be habitat creation and maintenance, as an example. The regulation of the climate by nature, as another example. Food, feed, energy, materials. These are the means to the end. So these are instrumental values. And on the other end of the anthropocentric value, the good quality of life, which are relational values. As an example, social cohesion, cultural identity, sense of place, mental or emotional health related with the these are relational values people have. So we talk about IP-based, its mission, vision. We also talked about the value and the type of values, the anthropocentric, non-anthropocentric, in terms of the foci of value. Is it about nature itself? It's about nature's benefit to people. It's about good quality of life. And the corresponding type of values are the intrinsic values, instrumental values, and relational values. Now let's spend a few minutes to think about how do we do this value elicitation? How values? We need to apply some sort of valuation process in order to understand that. In doing that, there is a unidimensional approach. Unidimensional means one way of thinking, one dimension, prioritizing through one particular dimension, which is, it could be economic way of valuing, it could be ecological way of valuing nature, it could be social, or it could be local and indigenous knowledge-based way of valuing. It could be utilitarian way of thinking, which has more utilitarian value. What's the utility of some form of nature to a given individual or society? And this approach is associated with a belief in material economic growth as the basis for a good quality of life. If we have a economic growth, then our quality of life would be better. So this is one way of single worldview. For example, it could be economic dominated valuation, ecological dominated valuation, social dominated valuation, cultural or indigenous knowledge dominated valuation. So you can have a one-dimensional way of thinking about it. You focus on three different aspects of the value: nature, nature's benefit to people, good quality of life. And your policy objective, if it is about nature, it's more about environmental conservation. If it is about nature's benefit to people, it could be more economic objective. If it's quality of life, it could be more towards social objectives. And through this, if we focus only on the nature's benefit to people through economic policy objective, then you follow economic valuation. Within the economic valuation, the tools or approach you follow is cost benefit analysis. So you assess what's the benefit associated with a particular form of nature, forest, river, lake, whatever it might be, and what's the cost associated with it, because it also imposes cost. So looking at both the benefit and cost, then you determine the values associated with that form of nature, and then you use economic incentive in order to protect, conserve, or improve those natural assets. You can follow the same route for the ecological dominated valuation. That's how you look at from only one particular worldview. On the other hand, you have these institutions and governance. They are running in parallel. Economic incentives through the institutions and governance, you apply them, and then they affect how the worldviews and how we, again, start to look at or value nature. These are, on the left-hand side, you have the focus, a policy objective, valuation approach, what kind of tools you use if you follow a particular valuation approach, and what's the policy instrument you apply. If it is pluralistic valuation, so the question is, we focus more on diverse form of valuation together, rather than only unidirectional way of valuing things, then you are interacting with diverse worldviews, not only economic, not only social, not only ecological, all of them, plus the local and indigenous knowledge-based system all together. And you also look at these foci of value together, good quality of life, contribution to people, nature. You also apply these policy objective, environmental objective, social objective, economic objective together. And you may have multiple type of valuation methods that you apply, which are diverse valuation. In some cases, you might use evaluation. In some cases, you might use biophysical valuation, or both or multiple of them together. Then from these different ways of valuing things, some of them may have a very one-to-one matching in terms of trying to integrate the values or aggregate the values. In some cases, you might have to modify it, or you might not have one-to-one matching because they are rooted in different philosophies. So the value you derive might be difficult to aggregate. But through participatory approach, deliberative discussions, and you will be able to breeze or integrate the value identified by diverse valuation. Then you use some form of policies, shared among all stakeholders, for example. And using this sort of policy instrument, then with the institution and governance mechanism you have, you manage nature in order to continuously provide intrinsic values, instrumental values, relational values, which affect people's well-being as well as benefit derived from nature. So that's generally how IPBS views in terms of how to think about nature and its value, and how to apply valuation techniques in order to understand the value of nature, and how to bring those understanding into policy making through policy instruments. We've integrated approach of value framing aims to bridge different value dimensions. So we talk about that. So we have unidimensional view here and pluralistic valuation approach here. It provides opportunity to bridge nature's contribution to values in terms of biophysical, sociocultural, economic, health, or holistic perspectives. I think I covered that. It also acknowledges the existence of different perception of good quality of life. So people may have different understanding of what does good quality of life mean. For an urban dweller, it might be something as opposed to for a rural resident, right? And role of institutions. So the institutions and governance are in the center place. So I think in principle, I introduce what is IPBS, what it does, what's the concept of value, what's the approach, or how do we value nature, and what's the valuation process, whether it is unidimensional or multidimensional. Unidimensional means thinking through only one worldview or discipline. Multidimensional or plural or diverse valuation means thinking holistically from different worldviews or disciplines together. And in practical sense, how do we implement it? A practical approach to this pluralistic valuation. It is assess, and it aims to facilitate comparability of valuation results as well as transparency and accountability of the valuation process. So here are the 5 different steps. In the center, we have diverse values of nature and its benefit to people. First of all, we identify the purpose of valuation, why we need to value a particular natural system or particular aspect of nature. What's the purpose here? It could be for decision-making purpose in order to protect or use that nature. It could be to raise the awareness among public or key stakeholders. It could be just for the accounting purpose. These days, we are talking about ecosystem accounting. For that, we need to understand the value of nature. So it could be just the accounting purpose, or it could be in a legal case or to fulfill the conflict, to resolve the conflict. Sometimes accidentally or intentionally, nature can be damaged by human actions. If it is intentional and it has a huge impact, then those who have damaged it needs to compensate those who are suffered from it. For that, there might be legal cases where you need to understand what's the value of that being damaged. By knowing the value, then you can assess the compensation. So it could be one or several of these purposes. Then the second step is you need to scope the valuation process. What does the scoping means? You need to consider different worldviews. You need to consider different foci of value, whether it is just the intrinsic part of the nature or instrumental part of the nature or the relational part of the nature. Then the value types, that's what I mean. The focus is nature, nature's contribution to people, and good quality of life. It also need some attention on the spatial and temporal dimensions according to the IP-based framework, whether it is a local scale or national scale or a global scale, whether it is a particular point in time or it's since 1990 to 2023 as an example in a temporal sense. Then undertaking the valuation or assessment, once you scope it out, then you select the method of valuation, one or multiple, diverse valuation, biophysical, cultural, economic, health, holistic, or indigenous and local knowledge-based system. Whichever the method is applicable, you select the valuation method. And you also assess the key potential trade-off among the types of values. It may be the case that the instrumental and relational values have a trade-off, means if one is increasing, another will be decreasing. Or they might have a synergistic relationship. If one type of value is increasing, another will also increase. If one is decreasing, another will also decrease. So what kind of potential trade-off are there? You also need to assess that. And the power relation among values holders. This is a little bit touchy subject in the sense that in society, there are different group of people. Some people may have influence over the others. They have a higher power than the others. And those powerful individuals or the groups could influence the result of valuation. So we need to understand that power relations among the value holders and try to balance that in the valuation process. Then the fourth aspect is integration and bridging. We set the purpose, we scope the process of valuation, we choose the valuation methods, and we assess the potential trade-offs and the power relation among key value holders. Then we implemented the method and we observe the values. Then we need to bridge or integrate the values derived from those valuation method, for which there are different ways of integration or bridging. It could be done through integrated modeling. It could be done using multi-criteria analysis. It could be done through narrative analysis, which is just based on the text, and it can also be done through deliberative evaluation, deliberative process in the society. You sit, discuss among key stakeholders and come to a consensus. Then finally, once you determine it, once you integrate it, then you need to communicate those values and review the valuation process. What we learn, how can we improve for the next round? Then obviously you need to disseminate the understanding of nature and the certainty associated with or the limitations associated with the evaluation process. You also need to state that when you are communicating. And if needed, then you will review it, or in a periodic basis, if it is for accounting purpose, then after 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, depending on the plan, you again have to repeat the same process. So this is how you implement a pluralistic way of evaluation in practice. In terms of the assessment, I mentioned earlier about the IP-based core functions, and one of that is to knowledge generation. Another one is the assessment. So thus far, IP-based has implemented number of assessments, and this one is the regional assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services targeted to Asia Pacific, which is your region, our region. The values assessment mentioned earlier was finished in 2022. Since 2018, it started in 2018. It was completed in 2022, and the reports of that are available. I will touch on a few aspects of it momentarily. What did the values assessment found? Then the sustainable use of wild species assessment. It was also finished in 2022, and invasive alien species. So all of these are the completed assessment. So at the moment, there are 2 assessments ongoing. One is transformative change assessment, and another is the nexus assessment. Nexus means the connection between water and biodiversity, connection between forest and biodiversity, connection between climate change and biodiversity, connection between different aspects like water, biodiversity, climate change, food system, all these different connections. And that's looked at through what is called nexus assessment, which is ongoing. And let me touch on some observations based on what I learned through this process. One of the observations I have is value monism is there and will remain there. So even though we have said the assessments have found that we need to consider multiple values in thinking, but the one value dimension or thinking through one value dimension is there, and it will remain there. But the acceptance of value pluralism in practice is increasing. So we are much more aware about the other kind of values than only our own values. And that sort of recognition is increasing, but it is not the case that we all are into the pluralism, value pluralism world as yet. The second observation I have is there is an increasing use of multiple worldviews and integrated valuation. So what it means, considering not only the Western scientific perspective when valuing nature, but also thinking from more on the, let's say, local and indigenous people's point of view or other form of knowledge, and not only using a particular valuation approach adapted by a particular discipline, ecological, economic, social, or something like that, but trying to integrate these different methods together to understand it in a holistic way. So here is a paper that was published in 2020. Science must embrace traditional and indigenous knowledge to solve our biodiversity crisis. And this sort of recognition is increasing. The third observation I have is we are still under a challenging world. Challenge still remains in bridging or integrating values that are stated or revealed through different valuation approaches or worldviews. This is, let's think about this as indigenous governance and institutions, 1A and B, custodial responsibility, scales, 2A and B, state governance and institutions, use and well-being. In the center, we have groundwater flows, within bank flows, over bank flows, recreational flows. This is about conceptualizing hydro-socio-ecological relationship to enable more integrated and inclusive water allocation planning. So the point I'm trying to highlight here is how many things from how many different directions one has to think quite carefully in order to think about hydro-socio-ecological relationship. It's the water abstraction, it's the water use for many different purposes and looking from many different type of institutions. So it's a messy world. We need to look at it in a very complex, we need to look at it from multiple perspective to understand the complex system. That's why the challenges are still there. And possibly the last is influencing policy through scientific evidence not only depends on how robust the findings are. First of all, we have to have a robust finding, credible finding, believable finding, but also on how we communicate the findings. It is about changing people's mindset. It is about changing behavior. It is about influencing people's psychology. So we need to use policy relevant language rather than policy prescriptive language. So that could help in order to embed values and valuation approaches in policy decisions when it comes to consider nature protection, conservation, and enhancement. If we aim for transformative change in nature conservation, then our value system and rigid disciplinary boundaries need to be receptive of other value systems and old views. Otherwise, we'll just replicate the status quo. So we need to be flexible. We need to be receptive to other old views, other viewpoints. We need to be going outside our disciplinary boundaries to understand things. So we need to be much more flexible in thinking and taking actions, going beyond our disciplinary boundaries. It's because in 2019, the IPBES completed the global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem service. And in terms of these nature's contribution to people, which are you can think of these are direct services that we receive from nature, which are provisioning in some ways, and some are regulating services here. Regulation of environmental processes from 1 to 10, habitat creation and maintenance to regulation of detrimental organism and biological processes. What we observe in the last 50 years, the global trend for most of these are either straight going down. There are two arrows heading down for habitat creation and maintenance. And these arrows, what type of indicator we have used. If we use the extent of suitable habitat, the area occupied, or if we use the biodiversity intactness in a given area, using both the indicators, the trend is declining, going down. Habitat creation and maintenance is deteriorating over the last 50 years. And if we think this directional trend across the region, if we think about what's happening across the region, when I say region, I'm referring to the IP-based region like Asia Pacific, Central Europe, Africa, America, and so forth. So the circular trend means in some cases, we can't definitely say what's happening because it's circular, it's moving in any direction, which means in some cases it is going up, in some cases it is going down, in some cases it is remaining as such. But this slanted arrow, they refers to, this is the horizontal arrow means it's remaining at that level. Vertical up and down means in some cases it's going up, in some other cases it's going down, depending on which indicator that we pick. So the clear message from this is irrespective of what kind of nature's contribution or benefit to people we are looking at, things are not that all heading towards different direction. So after these some observations, for the next 7-8 minutes, I would like to focus on the summary of the valuation as values assessment that was completed in 2022. And I'm going to share some of the findings of the values assessment. I described earlier what is IP base, what do we mean by value, how do we value things, which is the valuation process, and what are the observations that we have in relation to the application of the values and valuation in decision making or in other aspects in society. Now, I'm going to touch on some of the key findings of the values assessment. One is there is an inclusive value of nature. So it's not just about what I mentioned earlier, the intrinsic, instrumental, and relational values. There are different value typology. People started to frame them based on the worldviews and knowledge systems, which is the worldviews and knowledge systems. The values typology includes, these are illustrative examples, living from nature, living in nature, living with nature, living as nature. So that's how people started to frame living from nature, which is anthropocentric worldviews. Living in nature is also anthropocentric, but living with nature is a bio-ecocentric, and living as nature is the pluriocentric, pluricentric worldviews. In terms of the type of values, some of these are broad values like prosperity, livelihood, belonging, health, stewardship, responsibility, or oneness, harmony with nature. These are broad values. Within that, you have a specific values. Within the specific values, I talked earlier about relational values, intrinsic values, and instrumental values. So those three types of values are specific values, and they can also be framed in terms of how do we look at living from nature, living in nature, living with nature, living as nature. And these are examples of that sort of different values. And how do we indicate these different value types? Using quantitative measure or qualitative measures. The value indicator could be biophysical, could be monetary, could be sociocultural. For example, for the biophysical indicator, tons of fish could be a biophysical indicator. Price premium of eco-certified fish could be the monetary indicator. A gender-specific participation in fishing could be sociocultural indicator. So what kind of value indicator we are using in order to understand a specific form of value, how that link to the broad values and the worldviews or knowledge system is important in valuing nature. That's one of the findings of the values assessment. The second one is here we have this policy cycle and entry point from values perspective. We talk about, here is the policy cycle, how policy cycle operates. Let's start here. In the center, there are key stakeholders. Policy cycle starts from setting the agenda setting, then policy formulation, policy adoption, policy implementation, policy evaluation. That's how policy cycle runs. In those different phases of policy cycle, we can embed or we can enter into the valuation process. For example, in the agenda setting stage, commitment to agreed goals, that comes from the valuation perspective, which is valuation to inform agenda setting, valuation to design policy formulation, valuation to decide policy adoption, valuation to inform design and or decide policy implementation, it could be all of them, and valuation to inform what's next in the policy evaluation stage. So in the center, these are the policies, different policy cycle. These are the different stakeholders which interact with different stages of policy cycle. These are the different entry points for a specific policy phase from valuation perspective. Valuation purposes, an example here: to inform, to decide, to design. What do we mean by to inform? Raising awareness, education, justification, accounting, impact evaluation. Decide, decision support guidance, participative, cost benefit, or feasibility. So these are different examples of valuation processes for a specific purpose. On the left-hand side, we have here, let me take this, values typology. Well, we talked about earlier, and different pathways to future. Values typology is on the bottom, which underpins broad values of nature and intergenerational justice and biophysical limits. These underpin specific values of nature. So values typology is in the root, is in the base. On top of it, broad values are set, which are limited by these phenomena, these situations. And above the broad values, specific values are there: intrinsic values, instrumental values, relational values. And examples could be affirmative values framework, earth stewardship, and living well framework. These are the scenarios that can be developed: nature protection scenario and alternative values framework. These are different scenarios, like business as usual, green economy. So there are different scenarios that could arise in order to navigate towards the future in conserving or protecting nature for human well-being as well as other beings, for the benefit of other beings. The point I'm trying to emphasize is values typology, broad and specific values, are the root of how we want to prosper in the future for a sustainable and just future. I think, yep. This is the same thing. Values of nature and different pathways towards sustainability. I just mentioned that. And this is the last slide. I'm coming to the hour. So give me 1 minute. I'm about to be done. Value-centered leverage points to transformative change. So we understand that nature is deteriorating. Our hardship in terms of getting service from nature is becoming harder and harder. So how can we transform the current situation to a better one? And what can we do? Where are the value-centered actions that can be taken? And this is the diagram that is trying to show that. To start with, you can think of this is the, you see, this is the lever. Here is the more sustainable and just future. Bring it up. This is the lever. And here, these are the leverage points, different leverage points. For example, the first leverage point is undertake valuation. The second is embed valuation in inclusive decision making. If you undertake valuation, it is just a shallower leverage point. It does not yield what you are intending, but it at least recognizes the value of the nature, right? Just by doing valuation, we understand the value of nature. If we embed that results of valuation in decision making, we are meaningfully including the diverse values of nature in decision making. That's a better leverage point than just valuation. Even a better one, reform policies, rights, and regulations. If we do that using the information derived from valuation process, understanding different values of different stakeholders, then we could influence institutions which will embrace the diverse values of nature in their operations. And finally, a deeper leverage point is to shift societal norms and goals. So we need to think differently. We need to shift our value system in some ways in order to bring a substantive change or substantive progress in nature conservation for our own sake and nature's sake. If we do that, that would be a very huge leverage action point. And how do we do? We mobilize sustainability aligned values and shift development models. what it means, not only focusing on economic growth alone, but focusing on holistic growth, considering nature as a part of the development trajectory, emphasizing more or less equally to economic growth or something like that. Which, what does that mean? We need to think differently. We need to consider our goals and norms. We need to shift those things aligned with the value-centered approach of embedding values in development discourse. By doing this, potential for transformative change, if we simply take valuation, which is a shallower leverage point, the potential for transformative is small. If we take this sort of actions or deeper leverage points, the potential for transformative change means substantive change, substantive improvement in a positive way would be higher. So that's all from my side in terms of thinking about how do we value nature. So I think I basically talked about the IPBES and its conceptual model of values, valuation, the process, how it suggests one can do valuation of nature, what's the process of valuation, the practical approach in which you embed pluralistic values. I made some observations based on what we see in the literature and what we know from IPBES work. And I finally mentioned some of the latest finding of the valuation assessment in terms of what are the value types, how we influence policy cycle from valuation perspective, in what ways, and finally, what sort of actions and where and how we should take those actions for the desired changes, what we call transformative change. That's all from my side, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rampandit. I am Nesti, a moderator from this session. Thank you for a very insightful presentation. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot from you today. But before we move to the Q&A session, I have a question for you. So our participants come from the various countries. So what the same of the challenge or obstacle or opportunity to implement the approach for the some country, for example?
What are the implementation challenges or obstacles?
Both of my things.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting and applied question, I should say, because we have been experiencing challenges and obstacles. Otherwise, things would have been far better. One of the challenges and obstacle is, from the values and valuation perspective, our awareness itself is limited about the role nature plays in our life. Because we have been taking nature as granted all along up until this point, or even we are continuing to do so, but nature has started to show its action to us. Look what is happening across the globe at the moment, how systems are changing, how unwanted events are happening. It is because we transform nature in a negative way, whether it is climate change, whether it is biodiversity conservation, or whether it is about ecosystem services that we receive. So across the globe, across different regions, different countries, I just want our participants there to think much more closely about their place where they live and go back, depending on your age, go back 25 years and think how the nature look at that time, and then think right now how you view the same nature. You can think about wetland, you can think about the forest, you can think about the pristine hills, you can think about coastal areas, you can think about ocean. It's a broad term, but visualize yourself through that retrospective memory. Then you get to know that what are the challenges we are encountering? One is our understanding. That's what I highlighted. The second is our capacity to make substantive changes at once, because we always have been emphasizing economic growth. That's the first thing. If we have something on our plate, we can solve the problem of hand and mouth. That's the priority for many people in many parts of the world, because of poverty, because of the lower income, or whatever the cause could be. Then the emphasis on nature and nature's indirect influence on our well-being has been less prioritized, or even if people know it, their importance given to this sort of things was less. But now I think people started to realize that that's not the right way, and I think we have destroyed already. Now we are working towards recreating it. Better not to destroy in the first place, and then manage it in a way that helps us. So there are awareness related challenges, there are financial challenges to implement all the things at once, there are development priorities, varying development priorities, varying value, varying level of values. I mentioned in the beginning that the value refers to very many things. I highlighted 4 things there. It's about the principle, it's about a measure, it's about an indicator. So maybe we might be emphasizing more on financial aspect of it rather than the environmental, or rather than the cultural aspect of it. So I think that's why the challenges cannot be overcome just overnight. We need to think quite systematically, work in a very integrated, transdisciplinary way, and take actions which are much more transformative. Embed these things into the decision making. Alone does not help. What is going to actually influence is what kind of decisions the governments or local government or central government, depending on where you are from, they take, and how effectively those decisions are being implemented on the ground with the spirit of the type of things that I mentioned. So challenges on all steps. Financial capacity is another issue. Even if we know we don't have a capacity, human capacity or physical capacity, financial capacity. So these are challenges. But at one point I mentioned that we don't have a luxury to say, oh, we don't have it, we can't do it, because we are, again, affecting ourselves by not doing it. Thank you. Hope to answer your question in a way that is a bit broader than I thought originally.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pandit, for the answer the question. So it's time for the participant. Now we have some time for question and comment from the audience, online or offline. So please raise your hand if you have question, and wait the microphone will be reach you. And please state your name and your affiliation. Any question? Or maybe share the experience in each country. Okay, maybe not yet. So, Dr. Pandit, okay. I think it's very insightful for the approach. So we help to implement this approach for our country. So maybe you have a more suggestion for the Indonesians forestry to implement approach.
Okay. Well, I think, first of all, I would say that you are the expert who are working on the field, who are there day and night, looking at the trees, looking at the forested land, what's happening. You are the experts, and you know far better than me, specific to the Indonesian context. Nevertheless, based on my limited understanding, what I might say is Indonesia is a very influential country when it comes to the forest resources, because it is I think your country, the equator is in the middle of your country, I believe. So you have a tropical climate, tropical forest, and the biodiversity is very rich in Indonesia because of its geography itself, the islands, the mainlands, and all these different kind of geographical settings in which you live in. So Indonesia has very important role to play, not only for its own growth, but for global environmental conservation, particularly around the forest and then the biodiversity. What can be done? I think, if I may recall, your Honorable President has implemented a plan with a focus on forestry by certain time. He wanted it to be of certain, maybe certain percentage of forest would be managed in a particular way. I haven't read the entire plan, but I understood from some of my colleague here or students working on Indonesian forestry that quite an aggressive plan is there. You just need to implement those plans effectively. If you do that, then you are serving both the purposes. So I guess the time is whether you have embedded this different value-centric approach in your plan implementation or not. I'm not sure. I would suggest that you try to consider those things in decision making and then go forward. I think you have a fantastic and very progressive agenda in the forestry sector. You just keep going with this additional dimension that I highlighted in today's talk. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the just question. My question answering my question. So maybe some of participants have a question or any comment from the online participants. No, I think it's not yet, but in the same time we have limited time, so it's 5 minutes before leave. So I think I want to summarize the presentation from the Dr. Pandit. Their nature is perceived and valued in the starkly different and often conflicting ways. And Dr. Rampandit present the rationale for the inclusive valuation of the nature contribution to the people in the decision making, as well as about methodological steps for doing so. And with the context of the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, or PBS, with this approach is more widely applicable to initiative at the knowledge policy interface, which require a pluralistic approach to recognizing the diversity of value. So this is a transformation of the practice, and the aims to sustainable future will the benefit from embracing such the biodiversity, which require recognizing and adapting power relationships across stakeholder groups that hold different value on the human nature and relation and entity. So, and I think any question for the participant? No, maybe. Okay. So, Dr. Ram Pandit, very thank you for your presentation, for your time and your expertise, and for your shared knowledge in this session for the participant of summer course from Faculty of Forestry Universitas Gadjah Mada. So I'm so honored to be a moderator with your very insightful approach and new approach for our forestry and our forest and our forestry studies. So I think that time is over. So I appreciate for the audience. And okay, Mr. Dr. Pandit.
Yeah, I would like to thank you, Nesty, and all the team who were in touch with me in relation to this particular program. I appreciate your report, and I hope what I share may make sense in the coming days as you start to work in the field. Wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Prof. Ram.
For information, he is our quiz supervisor. So maybe next time we will connect again. So thank you for participants and time and place for the committee to continue the next agenda. For me, thank you very much, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much, Dr. Nesty, that has already been our moderator for the first lecture session of this day. Okay, since the speakers already left the Zoom meeting, so maybe we're gonna proceed to the documentation session with the speakers. Okay, then after this, we're gonna have a lunch session, and we'll be back here at 1 p.m. Thank you.